UK and beyond.
Join Britain's newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. It's scandal after scandal for the NHS. It repeatedly proves to the public that it can't always be trusted not to cover up. Why then is it allowed to prevent patients pursuing their right to life? And why do the courts impose draconian reporting restrictions on such cases? A young lady with a rare genetic disorder is being blocked from pursuing potentially life-saving care. And surely this is not justice. Have we entered the era of Cold War II? A parliamentary researcher has been arrested under suspicion of engaging in espionage on behalf of the Chinese communists. And while the Prime Minister has confronted the Chinese Premier at the G20 summit, the Business Secretary, Kemi Badenoch, has warned against escalation with the burgeoning superpower. The long, flowing river of civil service Remainer tears has reached its waterfall as former Chief Mandarin Lord MacDonald confesses to have breached the Civil Service Code by admitting to colleagues his Remainer inclinations as they cried and wailed over the Brexit referendum result. It merely reinforces what we all knew to be true. Plus, is there a net zero-shaped open goal staring the Tories in the face? New polling has suggested the public hugely favour reducing the cost of living over net zero policies. It's not surprising, but the question is, will the government listen to the voice of the people? State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a star-studded panel this evening. GB News' personal ray of sunshine, Dr. David Starkey, and the equally sunny GB News senior political commentator, Nigel Nelson. As always, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news of the day with Tatiana Sanchez.
Jacob, thank you very much and good evening. This is the latest from the GB Newsroom. The Prime Minister has told the House of Commons the sanctity of Westminster must be protected following Chinese spy allegations. It comes after an unnamed parliamentary researcher who was arrested in March issued a statement saying he's completely innocent. Rishi Sunak, who's been facing calls to designate China as a national security threat, told MPs such actions will not be tolerated.
The whole House is rightly appalled about reports of espionage in this building. The sanctity of this place must be protected, and the right of members to speak their minds without fear or sanction must be maintained. We will defend our democracy and our security. So I was emphatic with Premier Lee that actions which seek to undermine British democracy are completely unacceptable and will never be tolerated.
Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer has called on the Prime Minister to reveal what he knew and when.
China is a strategic challenge, that's for sure, and what we need is a policy that is clear and is settled. Now, we haven't had that for the last 10 years. We've had division and inconsistency from this government. But I think this morning, there's a very big question now for the Prime Minister, which is, was this raised when these arrests took place back in March, or has it only been raised now that it's come into the public domain? I think that's the central question that needs to be answered by the Prime Minister today.
GB News sources have confirmed terror suspect Daniel Khalif has been taken to Belmarsh High Security Prison. The 21-year-old appeared in court today, charged after escaping from Wandsworth Prison last week. He was arrested on Saturday after a 4-day manhunt. Westminster Magistrates Court was told the former soldier allegedly escaped by strapping himself to a food delivery vehicle using material which may have been bed sheets. Khalif disappeared while awaiting trial after being charged with terror offences in January. Administrators have said a further 9,100 Wilko employees will be made redundant by early October. It comes after a last-ditch bailout by HMV failed. The company had been in discussions to buy around 200 stores. The first 24 outlets are now scheduled to shut their doors tomorrow. And finally, pubs in England and Wales can continue selling takeaway pints as relaxed licensing rules have been extended. The rules were brought in to help pubs during COVID lockdowns. Pubs can now keep on selling pints until March 2025. They were meant to end this month after having been extended twice. Policing Minister Chris Philp says it's vital that we do everything we can to support British pubs. This is GB News across the UK on TV, in your car on digital radio and on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. Now it's back to Jacob.
The NHS has petrol almost scandals. We recently heard that Lucy Letby has been found guilty of murders, and that demonstrated some of the problems. As Alison Pearson put it, the NHS's warped human resources culture puts the well-being of staff above the safety of patients. But before that, we had the Nottingham maternity scandal, for which the independent midwife leading the investigation said families were simply not listened to and pushed away. This is a key point, not listening to families, pushing them away. Back in 2021, there was the young 13-year-old girl who died from sepsis after King's College London hospital staff failed to identify and properly treat the case and failed to listen to the parents who were increasingly concerned. There was also the Shrewsbury and Telford maternity scandal, in which many babies suffered brain damage or died, and mothers were left to take the blame. Once again, not listening to the patients and their immediate families. If we look back at history, there are other horrifying cases. The Harold Shipman case, the serial killer who murdered roughly 250 people. There's the contaminated blood scandal, the Staffordshire Hospital scandal, thalidomide, Primados. The evidence is pretty conclusive. The NHS may do many things wonderfully well, but when it makes mistakes, it covers them up, and it is not infallible in its diagnoses. And yet, in spite of all this evidence, the NHS has taken an unnamed patient to court over her and her family's attempt to resist palliative care and try nucleoside therapy in Canada, for which she needs to raise £1.5 million. The patient, known only as ST, owing to draconian reporting restrictions, suffers from a rare genetic disorder known as mitochondrial depletion syndrome. Her disorder now requires regular dialysis treatment, feeding through a gastronomy tube and a ventilator in order to breathe. The proposed move to palliative care by the NHS would see her die fairly quickly, which is why she and her family want a chance. They want to go and try the Canadian treatment as a last resort. But last month, a judge ruled that ST's fate is now the decision of the court, having been taken to court by the NHS, the family being taken to court to stop them having the treatment. And it was reported yesterday that the young lady's family is calling on the Health Secretary to give her a chance to save her life. But it should never have come to this. This young lady's suffering is immense. She is currently on course to be put on death row in a country that abolished the death penalty. The NHS is purely offering death. But who are these officials? Who are these bureaucrats in the NHS to tell this young lady that she has no right to pursue her last resort, to, in her own words, die trying to live? What's more, the court has imposed stringent reporting restrictions, maintaining the young lady's anonymity, which she does not want. It's been forced upon her. And this is turning anonymity on its head. The point of anonymity is to protect the patient, not to cover up for the hospital. The preservation of life is a foundational principle of our society, but it's being thwarted by the big state trampling on the rights of the individual. As always, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now, mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm very pleased to be joined now by Andrea Williams of Christian Concern, which is backing the family, as well as the barrister Philip Taylor. Philip, I'm going to come to you first, if I may, to explain the law. Why have the judges granted anonymity, as far as one can tell, against the wishes of the family, seemingly to protect the hospital?
Well, I think the reason is based upon this document, which is actually the Court of Protection Practice 2023. The problem, as I see it, is a one for Parliament and for people such as yourself, because the mess that we now have with the relevant legislation, which is the Mental Capacity Act, and the fact that, in fact, this court is actually a relatively new court with powers similar to the ones that we have in the family courts, where everything is secret, and we try to protect, as you've indicated, the individuals, unless they wish to name themselves, of course. The whole purpose is to try to protect people. The danger is that we've gone way beyond what we originally intended, and I've very much supported the Times newspaper on its attempt to try and open up some of these courts.
But to be fair to the court is simply implementing the law Parliament has given it to implement.
Yes, that is the position at the moment, and therefore you have a position where the judges, they're specialist judges, will make decisions. Their difficulty is very much based upon listening to experts and trying to work out which side of what is a very hard case to make a decision on. And I having been in those courts, I know how difficult it is.
So, Andrew, let's come to the NHS. Why, as far as you can tell, are they trying to stop somebody having a chance? Because we've seen other cases where people have tried to have a chance, the NHS has said it won't work, and it has worked.
Absolutely. There are people alive today that, despite prognoses, have gone on to live and to live fulfilling lives. And I think one of the tragic situations in this case, and also in a number of other recent cases, is that a decision has been taken when there is actually an alternative being offered. So we've heard them in the baby cases. There was baby Alfie Evans, there's baby Charlie Gard, where the parents actually have hoped to remove the children from the hospital. In the case of Alfie Evans, there was actually an air ambulance waiting at the end of the corridor.
But with children, even though both of those cases concern me greatly, it's easier to understand why the courts get involved and why the NHS tries to stop parents doing things. But in this case, she's a 19-year-old young lady. She, in the Daily Mail, as it showed, wants to have this treatment. She's able to communicate, to express her own wills.
She's a very striking young woman, certainly. And the point is this: this horrible disease was diagnosed very late for her. She did have some muscle loss and some difficulty, but the truth is this: that she did her GCSEs until this time last year. She was really well. She was in mainstream schooling. She caught COVID. And as a result of that, she had to go on some dialysis, had the tracheostomy put in. But all the way through, for one year since she's been in hospital, she's been told the prognosis is dire. You only have a few days to live. And she's been saying all the time, don't give me opioids. I want to be alert. Just paracetamol, please, because I want to live, not die. And if I die, I want to die trying to live.
And the NHS is basically treating her like a mad person.
They're saying it's delusional.
It's delusional.
They're saying because she will not accept her prognosis, because she will not accept what the doctors say. Let's bear in mind that 1 year ago they were saying you've just got 2 or 3 days to live. They say that because she won't accept it, she is deluded.
So they've already been wrong. She was told a year ago that she had 2 or 3 days to live.
Yes.
She's outlived that by a year.
Yes.
And they still won't listen to her or allow her to have this experimental treatment in Canada.
Which the point is this, the offers are coming in from around the world. There are some that are emerging even from Europe. She says, I want to try. Even today, even to do that interview with the Daily Mail, she has been able to explain herself in her own words. She has communicated in her own words this.
And Philip, how high a threshold do the courts have to have before they deem that you haven't got mental capacity to make a decision like this for yourself?
Well, that's a very interesting point, because the general approach would be, as we have with any burden of proof, it would be a balance of probabilities. In other words, the 51% to the 49% in terms of the balancing. I think the difficulty with...
But that shouldn't be on the balance of whether the treatment will work, but on the balance of whether this is a decision that a reasonable person could make.
Well, I think it should be done on that basis. I think one of the difficulties we have is the decision-making of the judiciary is one that is very secretive in these particular types of proceedings. I think they should be opened up. I do believe that we have a clash here between the rights of the individual as against the state telling the individual what to do, and that's what worries me.
And Andrew, there is a hearing, isn't there, a further hearing on the anonymity question?
Yes, and we're very much hoping that will open up. Justice is done in the light.
And when will that be?
It's not done behind closed doors. We don't yet have a date.
You don't have a date for the hearing. Well, the sooner that happens, the better, because it's so important that we know what's going on in our courts. And, of course, as Philip said, that we allow the individual to choose for themselves. Anyway, thank you to Andrea and Philip. Don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, are we on the verge of Cold War II?
This September, the GB News family is back together. From breakfast, right across the day, breaking the latest stories, and every evening. And don't forget the weekend. We've got the whole of the UK covered. Every week, we'll be hearing your views from up and down the country, with fun, lively and intelligent conversation with the biggest guests. This September, we'll meet Chris and John. Thank you for choosing GB News. We're proud to be Britain's news channel.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, nah, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Go.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Alan says, the plight of that young girl offered palliative care rather than a treatment that would prolong her life is a particularly strong reason why we should never entertain euthanasia. Brian says, a couple of years ago we were clapping for the NHS, and now they want to stop someone from fighting for their life. How can anyone trust these people anymore? And Graham says, what a crazy system we live under. The courts won't let us die by our own hand if we want assisted death, nor can we try to prolong our lives by other means. Makes no sense. They are playing God. It was in the winter of 1989 when the Berlin Wall collapsed, heralding the end of the 45-year Cold War and the beginning of freedom and prosperity for at least some of the Eastern Bloc. It wasn't long before this moment was declared, perhaps hubristically, the end of history. But such were the joys when the combination of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II defeated the evils of communism. It may not have been the end of history, but it improved the lot of millions of people. Since then, putting the problems with Russia to one side, it seems the commentariat has taken its eye off the burgeoning power of China. As you'll be aware, over the weekend it emerged that early this year a parliamentary researcher who worked closely in the upper echelons of power with the Foreign Affairs Select Committee chairman Alicia Cairns and former Tory leader, who is sanctioned by the Chinese communists, Sir Ian Duncan Smith, was arrested under the Official Secrets Act for allegedly spying on behalf of China. Whilst the researcher denies the allegations and remains on bail until next month, serious questions are posed by this affair, such as why MPs weren't informed. Why weren't the public told? Because this happened in March. But perhaps more broadly, is this merely the latest chapter in the emergence of Cold War II with China? Now, I'm joined by Mark Armand, communism historian and director of the Crisis Research Institute, Oxford. Well, thank you so much for joining me. How concerned should we be about this, about an apparent attempt by China to insert a spy into the Houses of Parliament? Of course, this is only alleged at the moment. Or how much is this just what countries do to each other? We all spy on each other and everyone knows that, and we should just relax.
Well, I think you're right to say that everybody spies on everybody else, but there's also the question of what are you spying for? And though if you're trying to influence and to, if you like, distort the politics of a country, as opposed to find out what kind of new gizmos they have in their defence systems and so on, then it's a more sinister process, not least in a democratic country like ours. So agents of influence, as it were, are what we're talking about, rather than the classic spy trying to steal the microfilm that contains the secrets of a new weapon or whatever.
And is this, in a quite interesting way, an operation that is very Chinese? That is to say, with its very long historic perspective, it's willing to have people in position for an extended period to provide information and to help form policy in a way that, as far as I'm aware, the British don't do. We don't have long-term sleepers.
Well, I think it's certainly difficult for a Western country like Britain to penetrate the security of China. one of the problems we have in dealing with China is just how secretive it is and how very little of how the decision-making process actually works is really understood in the West. Whereas a lot of what goes on in our countries, like Britain, like America and so on, is in the public domain. What is alleged here, though, is that somebody under the guise of being a severe critic of the Chinese Communist Party's dictatorship was actually operating to find out what the other critics, people in Parliament, as you say, and Duncan Smith and so on, what they are thinking, who they're talking to, where they have influence. And this takes me back in a way to the 1930s. We often think about Kim Philby as the classic communist from Cambridge who became a Soviet spy. But we forget that actually in the late 1930s, he was seen as a pro-fascist. He got a medal from Franco for his work in the Spanish Civil War. He was part of the pro-German, Anglo-German link. And so he manifested himself not as a leftist saying, be sympathetic to Uncle Joe, but as somebody saying, we really ought to cozy up to Hitler. And why was he doing that? Because, of course, he's trying to worm his way into the British elite. And if you like, 70 years later, 80 years later, we find this new process taking place. People pretending perhaps sometimes to be aggressively anti-communist, anti-Chinese, but actually maybe passing on information to Beijing.
OK, but the 1930s spies got into the secret services and knew the names of agents and passed those on. If you want to find out the views of Ian Duncan Smith or Alicia Cairns, you can just tune into GB News and you learn them anyway. So aren't the Chinese slightly overcomplicating their spying networks?
Well, they are. I suspect what they're interested in here is not so much the public views of British politicians, which, as you say, we can find many examples of, but who are they talking to? Who is giving them information? Particularly, obviously, the Chinese might well be interested in which citizens of China are perhaps privately communicating criticism of the government, information about the treatment of, say, Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and so on. So it's not so much the high-profile person themselves as the people with low profiles and the people who want to keep a discreet distance who they know.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Mark. I've still got my panel with me, Dr. David Starkey and Nigel Nelson. Nigel, should we reappraise our relationship with China altogether? Does this indicate that it is actually fundamentally a hostile state? What Mark was saying, his last point, was quite sinister. If they're trying to find out who our sources of information are, and they're in China, they could find serious ramifications in their lives if the Chinese government has got even relatively unimportant information.
Yes, and I think that Mark's point is very good. We've got to actually understand what Chinese spying means, which is not the wandering around with Minox cameras taking pictures of top-secret documents. So, yes, we have to reevaluate our relationship with China. No, we don't have to treat them as an enemy, but equally they're clearly not a friend. But we ought to start dealing with what China is doing to us. So, for instance, China's kind of spying is hoovering up a load of open source information. They get people into universities that, according to the report by Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee, still awaiting a government response, by the way, 10 months on, they're into every part of the British economy. That's a different kind of spying. That's actually trying to hoover up everything that they can, throw it over to the analysts to find out exactly what we're up to and what our policies might be towards China in the future.
And David, in your world, in the university world, they've thrown a lot of money at some universities.
And I'm afraid the University of Cambridge, and particularly Jesus College, and indeed a near contemporary of mine, Professor Peter Nolan, at the absolute heart of this process. And it's quite deliberate. And what Nigel is saying, this is an attempt, really, and again we need to understand what the essential basis of China's great leap forward has been. It has been the brilliant ability to imitate, to take our technology at its advanced level and then nudge it slightly forward to improve industrial technique, to, as it were, build on what we've done. You know, the famous remark, why is China doing so well? Well, it's standing on the shoulders of a giant, the West. But I think equally, we do need, and here I would slightly disagree with Nigel, I do think we need a fundamental rethink. China has expressed perfectly clearly what it intends to do. It intends to be the dominant world power. It has broken out of the old notion of China, which was restricted within its own frontiers, the idea of the Middle Kingdom. It is now ambitious for world power. Hence the Belt and Road Initiative, hence the attempt at turning African states and Polynesian states into client economies. But I also think, and I was very interested that you began with Fukuyama and the whole absurd notion of the end of history. What we in the West have forgotten, why our response to the Ukraine has been so completely incompetent, is that the very instruments that the West created, the United Nations and the Universal Declarations on Human Rights, Lavrov, the brilliantly intelligent, multilingual foreign minister of Russia, he has perverted them. The Soviets have perverted them, and now, of course, again, none of us seem to understand this. Do you remember? Oh, of course, China doesn't really want Russia to be invading. Of course, you know, they will distance themselves from the shocking Putin. Closer and closer. And sorry, Jacob, finally, did you notice what happened in India? Did you notice at G20? Everybody apart from the West cozied up to Putin and Xi. We were isolated because of our folly and our self-belief.
And what should we be doing about this? During the Cold War, we expelled Russian diplomats when there were Russian spying incidents. Should we be expelling some Chinese diplomats just to inconvenience their system? Should we be saying to universities, Jesus College, you can't take money of this kind with strings attached?
No, I think that if you start, you only expel foreign intelligence agents when you actually catch them doing something. So it was quite right that Theresa May expelled so many Russians from the embassy after Salisbury. That was that was an act of war. It wasn't just a warlike act.
But we didn't actually catch them. It was simply an act of counter-vengeance. And we simply demonstrated our own strength. Shouldn't we be doing that with Russia? I mean, it seems the same with China. I mean, sorry, Nigel, China understands one language, which is the language of power. We have shown ourselves astonishingly reluctant.
As Chairman Mao said, power comes from the barrel of the gun. And who thought I would end a section quoting Chairman Mao? Thank you to my panel. Coming up, has the river of civil service Remainer tears reached the waterfall? Plus, could net zero be the defining question of the next general election?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. A band of rain is going to continue to push southwards through the next 24 hours with some showers both to the north and south of this, whilst in the southeast we're holding on to that humid air because here we are still ahead of these fronts, which have something a little bit cooler, a bit more comfortable following in behind. Also on the fronts there'll be a fair bit of rain, so a cloudy, wet end to the day across many northern parts of England into Wales and southwest England too. In the southeast we're holding on to those humid conditions and we could see a few showers developing. Also some showers in the far north of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Cooler here, whilst in the southeast with that high humidity, temperatures not dropping a huge amount. As we look through Tuesday, a damp, wet start across many parts of England and Wales, though in the southeast a good deal of brightness. Though with the high humidity, I am expecting a few showers to kick off here, and they could be heavy, perhaps even thundery, whilst a brighter picture across the bulk of Scotland and Northern Ireland, a scattering of showers and a little bit of cloud at times too. A bit cooler than it has been through some recent days, getting to highs of around 24, perhaps 25 Celsius in the southeast. Wednesday morning may get off to a bit of a chilly start, couldn't rule out a touch of frost across some parts of Scotland, but otherwise a generally fine day for most until some wet and windy weather pushes in from the northwest as we go into the afternoon. That rain's then going to sweep further southwards later in the week, and temperatures are going to be much closer to average for the time of year than they were last week.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The
Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real, robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes, and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio, and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard.
We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often there will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jill says, if Parliament is infiltrated without knowledge, we really are wide open to any threat. And Jane says, this young, brave lady should be allowed to raise the money and decide for herself what she wants to do. My family would support her with a small donation, as I'm sure many others would. She is so brave, she deserves all the help and encouragement possible by the world to support her wishes. Well, thank you for that, Jane. It's no secret on this programme that we have highlighted the repeated instances of the breaching of the civil service's obligations to political impartiality. Indeed, when I was Minister for Government Efficiency, I made a particular point of trying to crack down on diversity courses such as Check Your Privilege and microaggressions. But in affirmation of what we already knew to be true, former top Mandarin Lord MacDonald has confessed that he told his team of civil servants that he was a Remainer, as he found them gyrating in misery after the Brexit referendum. Now, I've said before that I have no intention of stigmatising the whole civil service. I worked with many exceptional officials during my time in government. But this is an admission of a serious breach of the Civil Service Code, one that goes right to the heart of our Constitution. The question of civil service impartiality always seems to find itself on a cross-section with efficiency, which is why I commissioned a review of the civil service, which began in July last year. We asked the Cabinet Office today when it might be published, and it will be, but they haven't yet given us a date, so we wait with bated breath. Still with me is my brilliant panel, Dr. David Starkey and Nigel Nelson. David, there are some people who, when we bang on about the civil service being full of lefties, have thought that we just have sort of persecution mania and that it's nonsense.
You and me, persecution mania.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And that they're just wonderful.
Those prickly exteriors. Yes.
They're just wonderful, high-minded individuals. And now we know with Sue Gray and MacDonald that actually what we've thought is true, that it is not impartial, it's not following the Northcote Trevelyan principles. Really senior people have been undermining that whole principle of doing whatever the government of the day wants.
Indeed, but I mean, why not extend the list? I mean, look at Sir Gus O'Donnell. What does he say? He says what seems to me to be something even more betraying, that his responsibility isn't merely to Britain, it's to the world. That, you know, that ludicrous universalist mentality.
He wouldn't have lasted long as a civil servant to Elizabeth I, would he?
Can you imagine how Walsingham would have dealt with him? I think the pain would have been rather intense. But there's something else you mentioned there. You put there, as it were, as a pinnacle of achievement and responsibility, the Northcote Trevelyan reforms. Can I gently remind you, Jacob, as the errant member for the 19th century, whom arguably the greatest of 19th century prime ministers, Disraeli, he thought Northcote Trevelyan was a catastrophe. He thought that a permanent civil service that's deliberately modelled on the Chinese, why do we call them mandarins? Because it's modelled on the Chinese mandarinate, would inevitably lead to the same fossilisation in Britain as it had led to in China because of the prevalence of received opinion. And it is perfectly clear. In other words, I don't think we should be particularly talking about the leftism, though it's important.
It's the fossilised received opinion.
It's the fossilised received opinion. And that seems to me to be the thing that's utterly damning and I'm afraid is completely compatible with the Civil Service Code. And of course is being entrenched by things like Nolan. This notion that the expert knows better than mere politicians or the mere people.
But Nigel, isn't this really important that actually over the last 30 years there has been an effort to hand things over to experts which gives more power to civil servants who now turn out not to be impartial?
Well, I mean, I think that when it comes to their professional dealings, certainly in the 30-plus years I've been dealing with the civil service, I found them incredibly impartial, sometimes irritatingly so. In this particular case of Simon MacDonald, yes, he did break the Civil Service Code. There's no question about that by doing what he did. In the context of what he did, I can't get too excited about it, on the basis that it wasn't as if he was trying to influence the vote because he didn't announce how he'd voted until after it had taken place. He was trying to comfort staff who were upset about what was going on, and everyone knew he was probably remain there anyway.
But that's
Nigel,
the problem, isn't it? That he had to comfort staff because they were so upset by democratic votes.
And also,
I think that Brexit was actually something so out of the ordinary, so extraordinary. You can understand that behaviour would be somewhat extraordinary too. These were people at the Foreign Office who were
entire foreign policy
on the front line of Brexit.
But these were people whose entire lives had been built as a devotion to Europe. And
they
would
argue a devotion to Britain.
No, they would argue.
And the point that they would have made is that
Britain's best interests are in Europe.
Yes, that's right.
And the British
absolutely
people.
right, David, but that is actually they're actually arguing on behalf of British interests.
And the fact
but unfortunately, British democracy had just decided the opposite.
Which is fine.
It wasn't fine, because it is perfectly clear that the civil service, cooperating with in fact, the majority of that particular House of Commons, did its very best to frustrate a democratic vote in the name of exactly what you cited. No, please, Nigel, just one second. In the name of a higher perception of the national interest. The trouble is, the sort of civil service...
You're suggesting they thwarted Brexit after the
tried
had been made.
I'm saying they undoubtedly sought to reverse...
What I think the civil service were doing were things like trying to stop ministers behaving stupidly, which is also part of their job. So, for instance, when Rishi Sunak wanted to tear up all EU laws by the end of last year, 3,500 of them, that was never the intent.
Nigel, you are leaping over an enormous chasm of events. You should be talking about the premiership of Theresa May and the speakership of John Bercow, in which they were clearly operating with the highest echelons of the civil service, deliberately to frustrate the whole
Ollie Robbins negotiation.
And you were there and you knew it.
That's right.
I mean, you'll know better about whether or not the civil servants tried to thwart you.
What you mentioned about the retained EU law was the civil service working slowly so that we didn't repeal retaining law, which was a great loss.
But the whole thing is, but if you had done that, the original idea of that had been that we would import all EU law into British law because that was easy, and then gradually get rid of the ones that we no longer needed. Good idea. And that would then go through proper parliamentary scrutiny along the way to make sure you weren't making mistakes. So, for instance, had you gone ahead with what you originally planned to do, seatbelt law, as an example,
Seatbelt law wouldn't have gone because it's in primary legislation.
No, this is the whole point. Some of it is in British law, some of it is in EU law.
There was an ability to maintain any law that you needed.
But Nigel, just one second. Please, we're getting...
It wasn't going to get the scrutiny.
Nigel, we're getting lost in detail. The fundamental point is that there are two different views of what the public interest is. There's the public interest as determined by a democratic vote, and there's the public interest as it's perceived by a superior mandarinate that thinks that it knows better than everybody else.
That's a great point to end on. Thank you to my panel. Coming up, are the Tories about to abandon an open goal?
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train. Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There'll be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things. We've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue, at least for the moment, to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg. James Bond comes later. But it's rare in politics that opportunities are presented like a suckling pig on a silver platter with an apple in its mouth, so readily and easily available for the waiting politicians to enjoy. It's even rarer, however, when politicians willingly turn their backs on such an opportunity and ignore the chance to improve their political fortunes. Yet this increasingly appears to be the case as the government shies away from delaying net zero commitments in order to alleviate the financial burden upon the electorate. It's important to keep the climate change, of course it is, and this must be done within reason and an appropriate tempo. Philip, now Lord Hammond, the former Chancellor, not someone I invariably agree with, calculated that reaching net zero would cost the country £1 trillion. To foist this vast cost upon the people, with those predominantly affected being on the lowest incomes, would be an unduly harsh thing to do. It's most perplexing, and even Rees-Mogg struggles to uncover the reason as to why there's so much ardour to steam ahead with these regulations against the cost and the pain. Interestingly, recent research from People Polling has revealed the depths of unpopularity of the net zero regulations. Only 16% of people support the pursuit of net zero if it means increasing the cost of living, while 54% of people would rather the government focus on the cost of living regardless of whether it comes at the expense of net zero. The political capital to be gained from putting the brakes on net zero is clearer than ever, not least after the Uxbridge by-election was won because of a rejection of ULEZ. While the Conservatives appear to trail Labour in the polls, surely there is no better time to free ourselves from the environmental orthodoxy and take this most apparent of opportunities. Well, I'm joined now by Professor of Politics at Kent University and the founder of People Polling, Matt Goodwin. Matt, thank you very much for joining me. You've done this polling. Where do people stand on the concept of net zero when it's just offered to them with no context?
Well, if you give people just a straightforward question, do you support the push for net zero, then you'll often find that a large majority of voters will say, yes, absolutely. And if you ask them, do you support the fight against climate change? More often than not, voters will say, yes, absolutely. But the key point here is when you then actually explain to voters what these policies mean for them personally in terms of the financial costs, they become much less supportive of these policies.
And how sensitive are they to cost? And has there been any change in this? Has the cost of living crisis made people more concerned about costs than they may have been a couple of years ago?
I think partly we're seeing the effects of the cost of living crisis. I think also, in my view, voters are beginning to tune into what net zero means for them. I think the ULEZ issue in London and Greater London has been very important for that reason. The fact that voters are now beginning to think about, well, hang on a minute, this is actually imposing some very real financial penalties on motorists. And so as voters begin to look at the detail of the policy, what we're finding is more voters oppose some of these policies than support, and that's especially true among Conservatives.
So how does this divide up in terms of the ULEZ support and opposition amongst different categories of voters? You've got a very helpful chart, I think.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at all voters in the country, only 32% say they support ULEZ, about 42% say they oppose, the rest are undecided. If you then ask voters, well, would you like a ULEZ in your local area, they become much more strongly opposed. So typically about two-thirds of voters will say, I don't really want to have a ULEZ in my local area. If you then drill down into the voters that are going to be key for Rishi Sunak, those 2019 Conservatives, the people who voted for Boris Johnson, who voted for this big challenge to the status quo, well, they're absolutely convinced that they don't support ULEZ, they don't want a ULEZ in their local area, and they really want the government to zoom in on prioritising the cost of living crisis, even if that undermines some of these net zero goals. So what I'm pointing to here, Jacob, is widespread opposition to these policies.
Particularly from people who used to vote Conservative. Is it still sensible for Labour and the Lib Dems to appeal to the net zero proponents, or does it also apply to their voters? Is this a more general trend?
I think it's a difficult one for people like Keir Starmer, because on the one hand, yes, Labour voters and Lib Dem voters are a bit more supportive of these policies, but on the other hand, we can see clearly in the data that it really is the economically marginalised working class voters, it's the electricians, the mechanics, the white van drivers who are the most strongly opposed to these policies because they're likely to incur the financial costs of those policies. So, and I think also just lastly, a lot of voters are looking at the net zero agenda, in my view at least, and are seeing something that they often feel as being imposed on them from above, at the expense of the views of ordinary people.
Because one group you've got who support ULEZ are the new elite. Who are the new elite? Are these the people who are imposing it from above?
Well, I would argue that middle-class professionals, graduates, living in the city, very affluent, economically secure, usually enjoying positions of influence and power.
Probably have a new car already.
And probably have a new car already, probably will not be hit by the costs relating to ULEZ, will not be will not be suffering the costs of net zero personally, are very well insulated against some of those. And it's really that group that are the most supportive of this agenda. And it's not just on ULEZ, Jacob, it's also, if you look at issues like migration, if you look at issues around climate, if you look at issues around marriage and family, the new elite often have a very different view of these issues because they're the least likely to experience the negative effects of these policies.
And it extends beyond ULEZ. ULEZ has been the profile point, but that people expressing views on ULEZ have similar ones about boilers, about getting rid of petrol engines in cars and so on.
Well, I'm looking at this polling and I'm thinking, where are we going to be 5 to 10 years down the line? Because ULEZ is, in my mind, is the beginning of this debate. The fact that voters are tuning into this and are beginning to really get interested in this issue. What happens when we go to 15-minute cities? What happens when we go to heat pumps in homes, etc., etc.? This is the beginning of a bigger rebellion, I think.
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Finally, just before I came on air last Thursday, I was shaken but not stirred by a report that Charles Higson, the Fleming Estate commissioned author for a new adult James Bond novel, warned that the character should not be Jacob Rees-Mogg with a gun. I'd never previously seen myself in this role and was flattered by the suggestion, though I noticed that Roger Moore and I share the initials RM, and he was a superb James Bond. He made the films in his era when they were funny and engagingly ridiculous without the brutishness of some later versions. James Bond ought to be as Roger Moore was, cool, calm, collected and comfortable in his own skin, not some angst-ridden, wokey lefty who drinks fermented, lightly effervescent, sweetened black tea drinks. I'd much rather have a martini or know the quality of vintages of champagne and claret. That's what made Bond fun. So we've commissioned a poll, not one that Matt would approve of, to the Wild West of Twitter, asking who would make the best next James Bond. And the results are in. Idris Elba scored 15.2%, Tom Hardy scored 31.9%, I scored 43.8%, so clearly Moneypenny was instrumental in getting the results in, and it wasn't done by Spectre. Spectre does not tolerate failure. Now, talking about tolerating failure, we've got a great success coming up with Mr. Daniel Wooden next. What's up then?
Oh, you got my vote. Absolutely, Jacob. But look, we've got a big show ahead. Obviously, lots of revelations over the weekend about the blob taking over, something you are obviously acutely conscious of. So too the former Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who's going to be live in the studio to give an insight, actually, into what was going on with the civil service during the Truss administration, plus Paul Burrell and Lady Colin Campbell.
Well, I imagine you're as appalled as I am that Lord Macdonald broke Civil Service Code by saying that he was a Remainer and the whole of the Foreign Office was Remainer. Yeah. Well, that's all coming up after the weather. I'll be back at 8 o'clock tomorrow evening. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. And actually, at the weekend, we had a little precipitation in Somerset, a move away from the temperatures in over the 80s. But fortunately, the Chewstoke Harvest Home event was tremendous success with fine weather. That's all from me. Good night.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, very good evening to you. A band of rain is going to continue to push southwards through the next 24 hours with some showers both to the north and south of this, whilst in the southeast we're holding on to that humid air because here we are still ahead of these fronts, which have something a little bit cooler, a bit more comfortable following in behind. Also on the fronts there'll be a fair bit of rain, so a cloudy, wet end of the day across many northern parts of England into Wales and southwest England too. In the southeast we're holding on to those humid conditions and we could see a few showers developing. Also some showers in the far north of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Cooler here, whilst in the southeast with that high humidity, temperatures not dropping a huge amount. As we look through Tuesday, a damp, wet start across many parts of England and Wales, though in the southeast a good deal of brightness. Though with the high humidity, I am expecting a few showers to kick off here, and they could be heavy, perhaps even thundery, whilst a brighter picture across the bulk of Scotland and Northern Ireland, a scattering of showers and a little bit of cloud at times too. A bit cooler than it has been through some recent days, getting to highs of around 24, perhaps 25 Celsius in the southeast. Wednesday morning may get off to a bit of a chilly start, couldn't rule out a touch of frost across some parts of Scotland, but otherwise a generally fine day for most until some wet and windy weather pushes in from the northwest as we go into the afternoon. That rain's then going to sweep further southwards later in the week, and temperatures are going to be much closer to average for the time of year than they were last week.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us.